For many years, queer cinema was dominated by one name. John Waters was far from the only director who cast primarily LGBTQA actors in his films, but he was one of the most noteworthy. Waters primarily worked in the Baltimore area and hired local actors. They called themselves the Dreamlanders, many of whom were people Waters knew personally. Divine was a childhood friend who would become Waters' muse and creative partner. Others he met at beatnik bars. Edith Massey, most famous for playing in Pink Flamingos as Divine's egg-obsessed mother, was a bartender John Waters knew. Waters' films garnered a massive cult audience in the 70s and 80s, playing at midnight screenings across the country.
Wednesday, October 30th, 1974. Divine comes to Philadelphia. The fabulous lady, accompanied by her director, John Waters, has arrived to commemorate the first anniversary of Pink Flamingos. This so-called exercise in bad taste was just beginning its second year as the midnight attraction at TLA.
Waters' success, in part, was due to his films being among the first overtly queer films to gain distribution in America during this time, but also because of how unapologetically dirty and vile they were.
The scene is chaotic as the crowd waits impatiently to see those.
If all you know about Waters and Divine are Hairspray and Ursula, you have another thing coming if you flip on Multiple Maniacs or Pink Flamingos, or even Serial Mom for that matter, though that was made after Divine's passing. Whereas modern filmmakers try to create sanitized, positive representation, Waters embraced filth. He embraced the grotesque, the offensive. There was no line in the ground that Waters wouldn't somersault over.
Filth are my politics, filth is my life!
And you know what? I really miss that. A lot of grifters have appropriated the language that LGBTQA people use when criticizing rainbow capitalism. They use these terms in order to criticize representation. And while individual writers and artists are making great progress in order to further representation, and more importantly, they get jobs in industries where they can, get paid for their work, a lot of what they do is restricted or commodified by corporations who want to create inoffensive, marketable personas to sell to LGBTQA audiences in order to get more business without angering the bigoted. But does this work?
Or eat anything that you like, or do anything that you like. Just don't assume that I want to know your troubles.
I don't really think it's all that effective. Books are being banned left and right. Target has removed the option to buy queer literature for younger audiences. While some books like Genderqueer are targeted by bigots overtly, it does not end at books that are simply explicit. Heartstoppers is a graphic novel series that was adapted into a major Netflix show, and it was being challenged in schools and libraries during the peak of book banning in 2023. Parents in Mississippi claimed that Heartstoppers was pornographic and depicted imagery of a deviant nature. Of course, anyone who's read Heartstoppers knows it barely gets any more explicit than hand-holding and kissing. Any book that seems to feature any queer themes tends to get challenged as explicit, even if all that happens is a simple admission of attraction. When Becky Albertalli's Simon vs. the Homo Sapien Agenda was adapted into the film Love, Simon, the adaptation omitted several more explicit bits, though it's hard to call the book particularly explicit in any case. Both the film and book center on Simon, a closeted gay teen who keeps in contact with a digital pen pal. Another student stumbles on Simon's correspondence and uses the information as blackmail in order to hook up with one of Simon's friends. In both versions, Simon struggles with being closeted until, spoilers for both, he is outed to his entire school by the guy blackmailing him in retaliation for not fulfilling his end of the bargain, essentially. And here's where things diverge drastically. In the film Love, Simon, this outing is treated the same way a third act breakup might be, or a liar-revealed plot twist being unveiled.
He screenshotted my emails, and he's been using them to blackmail me for months. What does that have to do with us, Simon?
With Simon's secret revealed, every character has an emotional conversation with Simon, tension rises, but everything gets resolved relatively quickly. Oh, and everyone acts slightly out of character, too, in a way that seems weird. The film almost blames Simon for holding back on telling people that he's gay. Everyone seems upset that Simon didn't admit this to everyone early on, placing the blame, seemingly, on Simon.
So you made up a bunch of lies.
I trusted you. You know what? You're insanely stupid, Simon. Is that all these years, you being so picky with girls, I thought that maybe it was because you might like me too.
Everyone is upset with Simon for lying to them, until they aren't. And the film ends on a happy note. This arc takes place in about the last act of the film, roughly 20 to 30 minutes. In the book, however, this sequence is the entire second half of the novel. The conflict becomes much more under the surface. Familiar characters start acting different. Even positive portrayals of acceptance results in Simon feeling alienated and isolated. His friends get moody around him, some feeling a sense of betrayal, not because Simon lied to them, but because Simon didn't feel he could trust them with his secret. The relationship with his family shifts. His school treats him differently. It's realistic and messy, and at times genuinely upsetting because it feels far more real than the Hollywood glamorized film. But I also get why the changes were made in the first place. And Becky Albertalli, she was criticized for a while by readers for commodifying or appropriating queer characters, which ultimately, in order to quell the tirade of angry remarks or dismissive remarks, led to her coming out early as bisexual. In her statement, Albertalli admits she felt pressured into coming out, stating,
"It's okay if you're not out. It's okay if you're not ready. It's okay if you don't fully understand your identity yet. There's no time limit, no age limit, no one right way to be queer." And yet, a whole lot of these same people seem to know with absolute certainty that I was allo cishet. And the less certain I was, the more empathetically strangers felt the need to declare it. Apparently it was obvious from my writing. Simon's fine, but it was clearly written by a het. You can just tell. Her books aren't really for queer people.
And honestly, it's just kind of depressing. In a book that wrestles with the fears of coming out, she herself was forced to come out. All of this is messy and unpleasant and also very real and grounded in things that do happen. Obviously, Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens agenda isn't super dark. It's still a lighthearted book ultimately, and it's very optimistic considering what subjects it tackles. But the book does have a very real, very unpleasant half that got glossed over when Disney adapted it to make it safe for general audiences. However, there's a trend in more Disney-fied work, and I'm using Disney in particular for this as they're arguably the most guilty party, where stories either commodify queer representation or undercut authentic queer representation to prevent it from taking up too much space. Disney has of course produced some great examples of LGBTQA representation, like in The Owl House. But for every Owl House, there comes 11 first gay characters that Disney loves touting about. And they have maybe 3 lines, their sexuality never comes up, and they're often edited out of the Saudi Arabia release. Of course, Disney isn't the sole person responsible or accountable for all these problems. After all, critics reacted to the inclusion of LGBTQA characters in Disney media, no matter how small or insignificant it might be. Consider the backlash that Lightyear received for a brief sequence where 2 women kiss in the background of a shot. It eclipsed all other discussion surrounding the rest of this relatively mediocre, not that great film. I mean, more people talked about the kiss than talked about the dumb twist with Zurg, so what does that tell you?
I don't understand.
The reality is simply this. A company focused on profit and thus aims to make as much money as possible, and bigots are a demographic. Businesses can rely on bigots to send them money more than they can rely on LGBTQA people, because when you do representation wrong, the audience loses faith. Consider the backlash that occurred when Blizzard revealed their diversity chart that they used to determine if a character was diverse enough for release in Overwatch. Audiences in the LGBTQA population saw that as kind of commodifying. Companies want those bigots money, but they also want rainbow bucks. And rainbow bucks come in when you put in the little gay catnip to draw in the queer crowd during Pride Month. And then never after again, of course, because we get scraps from the table. You'd think by doing the bare minimum, maybe people will get wise to what they're doing, and many have. But they still turn a profit from delivering a bare minimum to the target demographic. It's fairly transparent when you see how they treated Nimona.
Do you think he saw us?
Yes.
N.D. Stevenson's Nimona is an award-winning graphic novel that Stevenson worked on while coming to terms with his trans and queer identity. The original graphic novel is messy in a way that lends itself to painful self-reflection. Stevenson himself has discussed his history growing up in a conservative household and how that affected his development as a person, and that influences all of his writing.
I'm saying this is wrong. They've been lying to us, manipulating us, Hordak, Shadow Weaver, all of them. Duh! Did you just figure that out?
If you're only familiar with Nimona thanks to the film, I highly recommend reading the graphic novel, since it also embodies the core thesis of this video, that we need more problematic, more messy queer characters, front and center, who are not moral bastions of hope, but sometimes just bad. Ballister is more of a calculating villain, and less of a noble man thrust into bad circumstances, and Nimona isn't just a metal punk in the graphic novel, but actually a genuinely ruthless gremlin who isn't just misunderstood, but actually a menace. I love them. They're amazing. They're my favorite. Now, that's not to say that Nimona as a film isn't messy or overtly queer. It certainly is, and in more ways than one. But the moral ambiguity of the original graphic novel is removed, as is the legitimate harm caused by Nimona and Ballister. It's also a testament to Stevenson's skills as a writer that you fall in love with genuine villains who genuinely want to do harm, something that would carry over into Stevenson's later work, She-Ra, in regards to the character of Catra.
You'd rather I left you there to die? What do you care? I know you all hate me! I never hated you!
But let's focus on Nimona for now. Blue Sky Studios was working on Nimona, and they did commodify some elements, shifting it, making it a little more sanitized. Ballister and Nimona, as I mentioned before, go from chaotic gremlins to misunderstood gremlins, with a little bit of chaos thrown in. They're more mega-mind than Catra. However, at no point did Blue Sky Studios compromise the queer text of the story. If anything, they refocus it, moving away from the not fitting in society and more into finding self-acceptance with those already on the outside, directly confronting the mainstream standards for their self-contradictory restrictions.
Because once everyone sees you as a villain, that's what you are. They only see you one way, no matter how hard you try. You gave it a good shot, though. I gotta hand it to you.
Rather than wrestling with oneself, they wrestle with society. It is society that is wrong, not the individual. And I believe that reflected on Stevenson's own personal journey.
Something about it seems so much bigger than me. I know that the comic was coming from the pain and the fear and the anger that I had in my heart at that time, but all of those seeds seem to have grown in that time and through this movie. It feels like I'm being taken along for the ride of this movie and maybe set a spark all these years ago that I didn't know I was setting. And now it's something that has grown and continues to grow.
Blue Sky Studio was owned by 20th Century Fox, who were then bought out by Disney. At the time of Disney's purchase of Fox, Nimona was about 75% complete, roughly. So Disney, naturally, with a new original film on their laps, chose to cancel the film. The project was eventually salvaged and became one of the biggest animated hits on Netflix, and was even nominated for an Academy Award. Ironically, Disney's animated film that year, Wish, did not get nominated for anything.
So cool, we're famous.
You've got to be kidding me.
Ah, I love us.
Clearly there is an appetite for legitimate representation outside of the sanitized version that Disney and other companies like Disney deliver us. There's a reason She-Ra did so well and remains a favorite among queer audiences, despite receiving continuous backlash from right-wing critics. And it did quite well, regardless of that criticism. Besides, frankly, they weren't the target demographic anyway. It was always families, younger audiences, and the older queer adults who didn't grow up with representation in the media outside of, again, Sailor Moon.
Oh, great. Why do you think they've entered the contest? They're girls and cousins, too.
And Catra is a messy character, complicated, whose arc is toxic and goes back and forth a few times in terms of whether it's positive or negative growth. She does awful things to the people close to her, and yet there's still a core humanity to her character that audiences were drawn to. It's interesting, it's valid, because that's how life is. Not everyone is a squeaky clean hero. Some people make mistakes, and some people double down on those mistakes, becoming incredibly toxic to be around. That's a human story. And it's a compelling story, especially for an antagonist. But likewise, it's just as compelling to say you can always be better. And you can always try to make amends, though it, of course, it will be hard sometimes for those you hurt to accept you.
You try so hard to play the big, bad villain, but your heart's never been in it, has it? What do you... Stop!
The other impact of these sanitized queer characters is that the media presents a narrative. Not simply that LGBTQA people are all good, but that they are all morally just, that the only defined way to be queer is to be acceptable, to be beautiful, to fit into society's standards as to what counts as good. And while there are cases like Nimona and the work of Stevenson at large that reject that normalcy, Disney and other corporations are selling you a version of queer identity that is acceptable to heteronormative society. It is pandering, yes, but it's pandering designed to make you buy into a product, because people generally want to watch media where they like the protagonists, and companies realize that if they stray too far from heteronormativity, mainstream audiences may reject the queer identity of the characters in question, or, as they so often love to say, feel as though something is being shoved down their throats. So often, critics of LGBTQA media get upset if representation isn't 100% perfect, while critics of the concept of representation entirely are angry if they're even told it exists at all. By trying to appeal to both demographics, they appeal to no one. In order to accommodate those critics, the characters are made safe, accessible, but quite frankly, appealing to these negative critics won't do much good. Last year, targets around the country were targeted by bigots because of their Pride merch shelves. Many people just flat out lied about the types of products provided, especially for kids. So it didn't matter what Target actually did. People were going to get mad, even if they had to lie about it. And you know, Target was targeted. They were threats on the employees, on the buildings, on the owners. So yeah, of course they were concerned. This was a serious thing. So while it is easy for us to say as the target demographic that they shouldn't have buckled to pressure, they had to consider the lives of their employees as well. The problem is that this emboldened a lot of nationalists into seeing that their methods were successful. But even the initial intent was flawed to begin with. You're trying to appeal to two demographics, and one of them is a group that will never be happy if you're appealing to the first. If you try to appeal to bigots, you will never satisfy the LGBTQ audience. And if you try to appeal to LGBTQA audiences, you'll never appeal to the bigots. They're contradictory. And as a result, you fail to make either demographic happy. This is the curse of rainbow capitalism. It's better to fully embrace one side or the other. Of course, it's not just media that's sanitizing queer content. Social media is too. YouTube's ad-friendly content often restricts how explicit your material can be. TikTok is so sanitized, people can't even discuss the concept of death without sounding like a Disney afternoon character. People are forced to commodify themselves in order to appeal to others, and are forced to conform to the sanitized imagery YouTube and TikTok promotes. That is not a criticism of the platform. I think it's good that we don't have necessarily some very vile stuff on here. But it does seem strange how a lot of anti-LGBTQA content can go unrestricted, while pro-LGBTQA content often does, and historically has, been restricted. We are fed a commercialized version of queerness in our art and in our life, all in order to market an expression of identity that's safe enough not to offend the people who are so easily offended that 11 frames in a Lightyear movie results in months of rage. But this also isn't a new phenomenon.
You can eat shit for all I care, Miss Sandstone.
I mentioned John Waters and Divine before. I focused on Waters' subversive writing, but not enough on Divine. Remember I mentioned Ursula? Yeah, so Divine was the physical inspiration for The Little Mermaid's Ursula.
One of the funnest facts about The Little Mermaid, I think, has to do with Ursula. I think one of her original inspirations was Divine.
Yeah.
From John Waters' Pink
Yeah.
Flamingos.
Kill everyone now! Put some! Get some!
This was part of the grand tradition of Disney villains being queer-coded, a term used so often that some people think it's a made-up term, but the reality is a very simple concept. During the Hays Code era, LGBTQA characters could not appear on screen at all. This was among other restrictions as well, such as kisses only lasting 3 seconds, the bad guy having to be beaten by the end of the film, no overt violence, etc.
That's what I'm going to do to you now. Tear the skin from your body. Slowly. Bit by bit.
Now, prior to the Hays Code, there were films with queer characters. Never heard of them? Vingarne might be the first queer movie ever made in 1916, adapting Herman Bang's 1902 novel, Mikhail. Salome is a 1922 film featuring an all-gay cast. One of the last major Hollywood films to feature overt queer themes before the Hays Code was put into effect was Dracula's Daughter, a sequel to Universal's Dracula, featuring a lesbian vampire.
Why are you looking at me that way? Yes, you'll do very well indeed.
But post-Code things changed. If you had any overtly queer film, there were films like The Children of Loneliness, a bizarre lost film that exists sort of like the gay equivalent of Reefer Madness, an exploitative mockudrama designed to scare people away from being gay. But gay people still existed in Hollywood. James Whale, for example, inserted queer themes into all of his movies. Others used film as a way to express themselves in subversive, less obvious ways. In many senses, they were like dog whistles. If you could hear the whistles, you'd pick up on the themes. Otherwise, it would go over your head.
The affectionate term, but the adore is Theo.
Theo. We're going to be great friends, Theo.
Like sisters?
Mainly, queer creators represented themselves through villains. If you want more detail, watch The Celluloid Closet, a 1995 documentary that James Summerchin repeatedly stole from, excessively. Now, typically speaking, villains could be less masculine, less overtly manly, and thus queerer. And writers and actors use this loophole, this blind spot in mainstream observation, repeatedly. Regardless, villains that subverted traditional gender expectations would continue to appear in film long after the Hays Code, with everyone from Norman Bates to Jafar demonstrating some elements of coding. Now, some critics at the time argued that the queer coding was a poor substitute for on-screen representation, and they are right. I completely agree. This is why over time, many villains just became more overtly queer. It's hard to watch Scream, for example, where the two killers are arguing like a married couple while placing themselves in very close proximity to one another and not thinking, so how long have you two been, you know what I'm saying.
I'm feeling woozy here!
Point is, for years, all audiences had for queer rep were villains. So, to an extent, it makes sense why we'd see this bounce in the other direction around the 2000s and to present day. It didn't help also that we saw a generation of audiences who had not seen themselves positively represented in media outside of like anime like Utena or Sailor Moon, again, for years would want more positive rep.
Your shirt. Tara?
Oh, and that's another thing too. Bury your gays. Gay characters who were likable were often killed in television and media, even into the 2010s. Like, sometimes immediately. So for years, if you were gay, or bi, or lesbian, or trans, you'd either be evil or killed off fairly quickly. Or, dragged off to super hell after confessing your love. Not thinking of any examples in particular with that one. Or you'd just be there for the appeal of a heterosexual audience, especially if you were femme or femme presenting. And if you were trans, well, you'd either be the punchline of a joke, a secret villain, or both, as in the case of Ace Ventura. It's no wonder that during the late 2000s, in conjunction with the rise of Tumblr, we started seeing a push for more positive queer rep. But by that same metric, we also saw the jigsaw pieces come together for what would become the sanitized version of queer rep that we're seeing across the media landscape today. As great as Tumblr was for giving young artists and writers, again, Andy Stevenson is one example, a platform to promote their work in the first place, it allowed businesses to look at the trends that started to assemble on Tumblr. The sanitized, squeaky clean soft boys, the wholesome lesbians, the chaotically anxious bisexual, the nervous, anxious trans person just waiting to come out. These are honest stories based on honest experience, yes. However, businesses don't see honesty and see that for what it is, an earnest narrative. They see it as, oh, this is getting attention. We can turn this into a product. And thus, honest experience became something they could sell and something you could buy. So yeah, there was a need for shows like Steven Universe in the 2010s. This push was necessary. It was the first of its kind in mainstream television. And while by today's standards it might seem like my little low stakes, this was remarkable. Don't forget, Steven Universe had the first on-screen queer wedding in a mainstream piece of animation. That's major. But it's also important to remember that works like Nimona, the graphic novel, were also coming out at that same time, works that were more complex. And these are works that are mainly aimed for younger audiences. They were way more very mature works that were being made for adults at the same time. I can do a whole thing on Clive Barker, for example, back in the 80s.
We have such sights to show you.
Again, we'll go into more works that were more mature later on this month, but for right now we're talking about the queer rep that gained the most traction in mainstream discussion on the internet and on television.
How can I help me?
There was room for messy, chaotic queer stories at this time, but that's become harder and harder to do as things change. For the success and reception of these positive LGBTQA stories, we also got carbon copies of them being product. And what's funny is a lot of these corporations pushed back on these initial ideas when they first came out. Steven Universe, for example, was truncated because Rebecca Sugar refused to compromise on their vision for the Ruby and Sapphire wedding. Cut several years later, and stuff like that becomes commodified for marketing purposes. The corporations did not believe they'd turn a profit, but once they turned a profit, they became exploited iconography. To an extent. Of course, we've never seen it. What's funny is the wedding is still leagues ahead of what you see in mainstream animation today. The problem is imagery like it has become more commonplace without the thought, intimacy, build-up, etc. in corporate products specifically. Artist-driven products, that's different, but corporate products have incorporated this imagery on occasion to sell tickets. And in the most mild, inoffensive, easy to edit out ways possible. That imagery has been recycled.
Are you asking me on a date? Your pulse and heartbeat have quickened. No.
As a result of all this, certain imagery that was once validating has outstayed its welcome, becoming inauthentic because corporations have dug up something, taken something to sell a product. Ultimately, companies are quick to use LGBTQA narratives to make a quick buck, provided they are commodified enough to sell. but only for as long as they absolutely have to. The moment that they no longer need to use queer media to promote themselves, they will drop it like a bad habit, and nowhere is that more clear than in the case of MAPPA. MAPPA is a major anime studio, and the anime that built their entire empire, an empire consisting of multiple shonen anime. All of that is thanks to the success of one anime from 2016 that put MAPPA on the map. Yuri on Ice. To say MAPPA became successful because of this gay ice skating anime is an understatement. It built a foundation of clout, which MAPPA then used as leverage to get bigger and bigger jobs. MAPPA produces a massive amount of anime every year following the success of Yuri on Ice. So you'd think they'd be grateful for this series. You know, treat it well, treat it like the prized crown. New Line Cinema is still in some circles called the house that Freddy built because of the success of Freddy Krueger. But MAPPA has shown very little gratitude towards the show that launched its studios, not even fulfilling promises to fans to continue the story. Following the monumental success of Yuri on Ice, MAPPA announced a prequel movie. This is of course after the show implied there'd be a season 2. And to be fair, there are several anime out there centered on sports that built on popularity season to season. Look at Haikyuu or Free. Those shows became massive after repeated seasons were released. Anyway, for years MAPPA teased Yuri on Ice's movie follow-up Ice Adolescence, all while announcing new projects or taking over Attack on Titan for its last season. News would come as a trickle feed to the fans, and fans were eager for scraps for over half a decade before MAPPA, one day, just canceled Ice Adolescence outright. But that's not bad enough. The studio also had to rub salt in the wound. When discussing Jujutsu Kaisen's success, MAPPA's CEO declared that Yuri on Ice made them comparatively little money, especially when compared to major shonen shows. Yeah, but do you know what else it did? Its success made it possible for you to get the contracts to animate those major shonen shows. Oh, and by the way, none of this is even touching upon MAPPA's terrible working conditions or the awful pay rate. This is just my bitterness that one of the better anime to come out of the 2010s got treated worse than The Devil's a Part-Timer. But again, I digress. Let me know if one day you want me to make a Yuri on Ice video. I will if there's enough demand for it. Point is, MAPPA used queer media, exploited it for profit, only to cast it aside when they were done with it just to garner success. And none of this is a reflection of the countless artists and brilliant people behind the scenes on Yuri on Ice who pushed for years to get this made. The fact that they failed to make Yuri on Ice a series as big as Haikyuu is proof that MAPPA just saw it as an asset to increase their bottom line more than anything else. So, what's the solution? Bring queer talent in to make their stories, their messy, mean-spirited, cruel, sassy, sarcastic, problematic stories. The recent trend exists as a response to queer creatives trying to rebalance the scales of the previous generations, where the underground scene was the only way LGBTQA content could be created, where the caveat was to make it more exploitative, to make it more extreme, to put butts in seats. But now we've seen the opposite happen. The pendulum is swung in the opposite direction, and we need to become more exploitative, more trashy, and embrace, at times, not always, but at times, the more exploitative and extreme. This is in order to rebalance the scales, not to tip the scales in the other direction. We still have a place for honest, intimate, sweet stories, but we also need the crasser stuff, the meaner stuff, the crueler stuff, the stuff that is offensive by its design. Because companies only want the image of safety. They don't really care about going too far. Take a look at Saltburn, for example, a movie that garnered great controversy because it showed some pretty messy, pretty extreme stuff for the modern day. You compare Saltburn to Pink Flamingos, it's tame. It's extremely tame. But for the 2020s, Saltburn was extreme. It wouldn't have been extreme in the underground 70s scene, however. That's proof that we've pushed the scales too far in one direction. We need something to come to tilt it and rebalance things just a bit. There are several novels and comic books out there that bring this kind of messy, problematic, realistic queer rep to life. But mainstream studios just aren't welcoming of it outside of niche genre affairs. John Waters has been struggling to get funding for his upcoming film project, despite his likeness and image becoming part of the Hollywood landscape. Hollywood seems eager to put John Waters front and center in front of The Simpsons or in television as a personality, but they don't seem interested in funding his film projects, the very thing that elevated his name to such a success. Occasionally, we will get something that is subversive. Now, later this month, I'm going to go into the ground being covered by horror and comic books, but mainstream films can stand to learn a lot from the world of literary fiction. A great example of queer rep in recent media that I'd like to see more of is, again, Leigh Bardugo's Grishaverse novels, especially Six of Crows, which, again, like Yuri on Ice, I keep bringing up in these videos. This entire series is about a group of chaotic criminal bisexuals and their one token straight friend going on crimes and being absolute menaces to society. It's fantastic. It even got partially adapted into a Netflix series that was, again, cancelled. This keeps happening, in case you haven't noticed. So, you see what I'm saying right now? Even the good stuff we get is cancelled before we can even enjoy it. And Shadow and Bone, the adaptation, quote-unquote, of Six of Crows, that was doing fairly well. It had a pretty big audience. It was in Netflix top 50 of last year. It just wasn't the top 10. And for Netflix, that's not enough. If it's not top 10, it's going to get canceled. Point is, these works are still out there. Celebrate them. Seek them out. Maybe we can make them so successful that one day Disney will option the rights to them and do literally nothing with them as they realize they can't actually use the IP without offending the people who cry about 11 frames of animation from Lightyear. But at the very least, our patronage towards the arts that we support and want to see more of will convince at least some companies to pay queer creatives. And at the end of the day, that's the most important thing. Real people being able to make a living off of art that makes life, for so many of us, bearable.
After 35 years of knowing John Waters, I turned to my wife and I said to her, I have the feeling this man is gay.
I'd like to thank Chloe Sunflora and Jazzy for their little readings in the video before. That really was a big help. I know Jazzy in particular loves N.D. Stevenson and all that, so she was very excited to do that recording. This is the first of several projects I'm doing for Pride Month, and hopefully, like the rest, the next couple will be very, very intense. So, hope you're ready for some stuff.